Hello and welcome to my 8th video in my Part 4 Java MTA course. In this video we're going to be looking at the scope of your variables and how to understand the scope when reading your code. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the key information that you need to remember and then give you some MTA style questions for you to test your knowledge. So for the scope you need to understand when your variables are accessible. So if we imagine we have some code here and we have a main method. Inside our main method we've created an additional block of code. So these curly brackets allow us to create some additional scope within our code. And then we also have an if statement here. So what you'll need to do, we've created 3 variables. You need to understand the scope of each of those variables. So the first number, or the number 1 line on line 6, this can be accessed anywhere within the white box. So it can be accessed from line 6 all the way down to line 15. So between the curly brackets of line 5 and line 16, any of that on that number 1 or that number variable can be accessed. So you can access that variable anywhere in between there. If we look at number 2 variable, this can only be accessed in the purple box. So we have those curly brackets line 7 and line 9. That is the scope of that number 2 variable. So if you created another line on line 9 and pushed that curly bracket onto line 10, you'll still be able to access that number 2 variable. However, once you go beyond that curly bracket, that number 2 variable cannot be accessed anymore. It's past the scope of that variable. It's the same with these if statement. So number 3 can only be accessed within the orange box. So again, we're looking from line 11 to line 14. So once you've created that number 3, that can only be accessed within those curly brackets. So what I'm going to do now is going to give you some MTA style questions and see if you can answer those questions using the information you learned about scopes. Okay, so we have 2 pieces of code here. What I would like you to do is look at this code and see if you can answer the questions. So pause the video now and try and create some answers, and then we'll go through them. So hopefully you've paused the video. Let's see. So if we look at the first one, we've created a variable called text1, and so the scope of text1 would be throughout this code. We've also created a variable called number1, and number1 would be accessible from between these brackets. So if we go through the code, text1 would be fine. Create number 1 in line 5. Because text1 is accessible from within the brackets, what will happen is text1 would be changed from A to B. So this would print out B first. But the problem is number 1 is not accessible. So number 1 variable or number 1 variable is only accessible between those brackets. So this would produce an error. So there would be no output. It would produce an error and not run. So if number 10 didn't exist, it would print B. Because there is a line number 10 that has an error, it would produce an error. Number 2, what would you have to do, or where would you have to insert line 10 to remove the error? Well, if we look at number 1, we want to print out number 1. Number 1 is only accessible within those curly brackets, so I would move it to line 7. And by moving it to line 7, you would print out number 9. This would be okay. And then you would print out B. So the output of that would be 9B. Number 3. What is the scope of number 2? So if we look here, number 2 has been created on line 6. So the scope of it would be all the way down to the brackets of the closing bracket for that if statement. So if we go down here, it would be accessible within our for, because our for statement is within our if statement. And so it would go from line 6 to line 12 because that is the closing bracket of our if statement. At the moment, number 4, so let's say I would say 6 to 12. And number 4, to remove the error, because there's an error on line 13, which line do you have to move line 6 to? So what we want number 2 to be accessible both within our if statement and within our for statement, and also outside our if statement, which means we need to move our number 2 to outside it. So if we created that number 2 on line 4, and so if we move line 6 to line 4, this means that our for statement would still be able to access it, and our line 13 will still be able to access it, and it would get rid of that error. So if we move it to line 4, that would solve the error in the second piece of coding. So we're coming to the end of the video now. So if you can answer these questions, then I think you have a good understanding of the knowledge within this video. So if you know how to determine what the scope of a variable is, then I think this is the kind of information that you must know to pass an MTA exam. If you are able to create your own scope within a method, then I think you've started applying the knowledge you've learned to your own code. I think that's very good, and it's a little bit more than you need to know from the MTA exam. And if you can create a scope challenge for other learners, I think that would be extremely useful. And if you could leave that scope challenge in the comments below, that would be wonderful. If you have enjoyed the video or you found the video useful, please like. And if you would like to get more mock tests and mock questions for the MTA exam, please subscribe and I'll continue publishing them, and then you can be notified when I do. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.